Good evening. Let's begin. I have just a few notes about the nature of prophecy. Someone was asking earlier, what do you think is the Gog of Gog and Magog, the king, or it says Nasi Rosh, the head president apparently of Meshech and Tuval? Is that Vladimir Putin? Well, I don't really know. I don't really know if I can know. I don't know why anybody would be interested in this. Although the idea of eschatology and if certain people who live in our day and age, or perhaps prominent wicked people who have lived in previous generations, could fit various explicit biblical prophecies about a Gog or what the sages refer to as an Armilus. One Mafarish translated as what we would know as an antichrist. Do these things even matter? And the answer is, I guess they do matter a little bit, but no one can really know. I'd like to address or bring up three issues with regards to prophecy, biblical prophecy. And once we have these rules in hand, we could begin to address these issues. So the first one is something that actually comes out from this week's Parsha. And that is that a prophecy only has its perfect meaning to us after the fact. That once it comes true, then we could actually work it out. And sometimes God himself can change the rules of the game. And because he has promised something and said it in the prophecy, he can let it play out a different way in order to uphold the prophecy, as though he's obligated himself, so to speak. And he has to make it come true. But sometimes it doesn't, people are not worthy of it if it's a good promise, so he has to delay it. The best example, like I said, is this week's Parashah. God promised Abraham, Vidor v'i yashuvu hena. He promised him the land of Canaan, but not entirely to him. Abraham started selling land of Canaan. He became a great landowner. You are the Elohim, which would be a great leader, a prince of God. It's their expression saying just shy of a king because Abraham didn't wear a crown. But Abraham, who made war with other kings and had diplomatic relations with other ones, basically was on the level of a king. So he became a great man in the land of Canaan. But God promised him the land entirely to his fourth generation, Dor Rivi'i Yeshuvu Hena, after being strangers in a land not their own and being oppressed. And if you're a careful reader of the book of Genesis, you'll see that that actually was supposed to come true to the exact fourth generation. Fourth generation from Abraham would be Jacob's sons. And they're the ones who came back from an oppression in exile, which wasn't so bad actually when you think about it, as their own grandfathers. So Lavan, Arami Oved Avi, Lavan tried to destroy everything. Uh, of course, it wasn't as bad as a Holocaust, and it certainly wasn't the Shibud Mitzrayim, but it was not the best. And they came back to the land of Israel, and they began to conquer the land and settle the land. But because of their infighting amongst the brothers, God changed the plan a little bit and sent them down to Egypt to suffer oppression for many years. And the prophecy came true in a different way. Similarly, when the people sinned, God told Moses, leave me alone, I'll destroy the people of Israel, and I'll make you into a great nation instead of them. Why do you have to promise them that? Because God had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that a great nation would come from them. So if he's going to destroy the people of Israel as we knew it back then he would have to somehow keep that promise by working with the sole survivor, with Moses, and making him to a great nation. And of course, we know that at the sin of the golden calf and at the sin of the spies, Moses intervened and prayed on the people's behalf and saved them. But you see that we come across this very important rule of prophecy. You only know how it's going to work out after it works out. So if you're sitting around saying, "Oh, I know the prophecy has to come true right now," or "I see it's going to come true, perhaps sometime in the distant or near future, and here's how it's going to play out," you're very well going to be wrong. Why? Because you're going to know after it happens. Okay. Now we saw that example. The third example. The second rule. The bad does not have to happen. This is Jeremiah's rule. Jeremiah explaining how to test a true prophet and expose a false prophet. And this is actually brought in greater detail by Maimonides in the laws of Yesodei Torah, explaining how the fundamentals of prophecy work. That is, the promises, when promises of good are made by God, blessings of good fortune, good tidings, that has to come true. But if it's the bad, the Puranot, that doesn't, Puranut, sorry, that does not have to come true. And just because a prophet enunciated doom and gloom, it doesn't mean it actually has to happen. And even if it does have to happen, perhaps it could be interpreted in the best possible way. For example, in the time leading up to the destruction of the first temple and the first commonwealth, the prophets had uh, told them that God has already decreed their suffering, the destruction of the temple, and the exile. In the times of Jeremiah, if the people had accepted the Babylonian oppression, perhaps it wouldn't have been so bad. Many would not have died. Perhaps it would have just been that the main people were taken into exile into Babylon, and the state was, I guess, the state was this was taken apart, and the temple was put out of service for a while. And because the people did not heed the prophet and accept the yoke of the Babylonians, instead it resulted in a bloodbath and the utter destruction of the temple. And even after that, they were given a second chance. Why do we have it Tzom Gedalia? Because at a certain point, they had a chance to recover. And uh, so what could have happened? They could have recovered quite quickly. They still had a skeleton system and a little system of self-governance, a little bit of autonomy. And the people ruined that, at least some of the people. And that's it. So it was the complete destruction of the people. And that's why we have a fast day, by the way, on Tzom Gedalia. The point is, the bad does not have to happen. And even if it does have to happen, it could be in the least bad way. Okay. Third, prophecy is less a prediction of the future and more of moral instruction. That's very important. You could keep looking. People can try. I think it's a fool's errand trying to match, let's say, what's contemporary happenings with what is promised or what is uh, predicted in the words of the prophets. People have been doing this for thousands of years. For example, they've been waiting for the Messiah to come, and unfortunately, one of the greatest tests and perhaps one of the most greatest misfortunes that have befallen us is when people were expecting Messiah to already show up. And what happens? He didn't show up. And then people went off the derech. Maimonides says this, others have also pointed this out. Instead, one should just have faith in God, try to keep the commandments of the Torah, serve God, have fear of heaven, and of course study the Torah and hope and bring it about yourself. But it doesn't mean that it's going to happen necessarily in your days. Instead, it's less of a prediction of the future and more of moral instruction. That is, uh, you're supposed to act on the words of the prophet. The prophet's there to rebuke the people. That's his main goal. He's not supposed to come up with new ideas. He's supposed to correct their behavior. And when we have a prophecy, and this is lost on many people, especially nowadays, the last two generations with the advent of Zionism, uh, you're not supposed to just sit back and hope the prophecies happen. You actually have to do your part to make it happen. So it's a commandment. You have to let it come true. So we learned this from the prophet Nathan, who delivered the message to King David that Solomon would be his heir. So Nathan strove to make it actually happen, even though David had other sons who were rivals for the throne. So too, if God has told us that there's supposed to be a reconstitution of the Jewish nation in our days, and there's supposed to be a Jewish state, and it's supposed to be the ingathering of exiles and rebuilding the temple, etc. It's not good enough for us to just sit back, keep Shabbos and Kashrus, and I guess in Lakewood and in Muncie and Buenos Aires, and hope that one day God will just bring it back to the land of Israel and everything will be hunky dory. It is our job to do our part to try to be in the land of Israel and try to keep those commandments also, especially the ones that have been defunct for some millennia even. It's our job to try to make that happen. So now with these rules, and now you understand these rules, we can look at this. Gomer and Magog. The names mentioned explicitly here in the book of Yechezkel, they're first introduced in Sefer Bereshith. We just read about it last week. They're descendants of Noah. And more romantic scholars, especially of the last few hundred years, both Jew and Gentile alike, tried to find linguistic similarities between, let's say, a name like Meshech, They see, ooh, Moscow. And they see names like Ashkenaz, and they see Togarma and other things. And they try to say, well, Ashkenaz, because in the times of the Talmud already, that was referred to, they were referring to Germania as that Jews did, even though Germania is mentioned also explicitly already in Mishnaic times. So Germany's had its name for 2,000 years. Germany's been called Germany, at least when we pronounce the G as a hard G, among Jews since before the destruction of the temple. Yet Jews start calling it Ashkenaz. It doesn't mean that the Ashkenaz mentioned in the book of Genesis, which is apparently somewhere in the Middle East, like most of those other places mentioned. How far away do we get from the Middle East? Greece. Is Greece in the Middle East? Greece is mentioned explicitly in the book of Genesis. But is Ashkenaz what later known as Ashkenaz? Probably not. So too, most of those names have to be in an area that was at least known or well known to the biblical authors. So you are not going to have a place mentioned beyond the known world at the time. You're not going to have China and Australia and North America and South America, or even uh, the Europe beyond the Alps mentioned in Genesis. So it is not likely that Russia is the place that is explicitly mentioned here. Gomer, Magog, and Gog and Magog, etc. Those seem to be places near the Caspian Sea, and uh, more honest attempts at identifying these places. You could look at it, for example, just the Sonsino. The Sonsino was the Chumash came out. It's pre-state. I think it's from the 1930s, so it's almost 90 years old now. As a Perush, he mentions it as the Scythians and the Cimmerians, etc. That seems to be a more honest approach. So, is it literally talking about them? I don't think so. However, and this is important, the sages themselves assume that these names are just stand-ins. These names are just there as proverbial barbarian tribes. Why? Because the point of the war of Gog and Magog, as the sages said explicitly, they said that God perhaps would have made uh, King Hezekiah the Messiah, so his apocalyptic war, his war of Gog and Magog, could have been fulfilled with the arrival of the Assyrian hordes. Assyria is Ashur. Ashur is one of the sons of Shem. He is one of the most prominent biblical nations that has always been clearly identified and well known to our people and to the entire world. So, how could the Assyrians become uh, the people of Magog, and how could their leader's son Cheriv and Esar Chadon and the rest of those kings be identified with Gog? That's not their name at all. So sages say somehow after the fact, once it would have happened, it would have they would have realized, the prophecy came true. And this was a prophecy, by the way. Gog and Magog is mentioned explicitly where it's in Ezekiel, who is basically became a prophet right about the time of the destruction of the first temple, and Hezekiah lived more than a century before that. So you understand they always had this concept, but it doesn't mean that it has to come true exactly as it's there. You only understand it afterwards. So is Russia the proverbial lands? They're going to lead this confederation of nations against the people of Israel at the end of days? Well, so far, no. Uh, However, if you do have a group that tries to do such a thing, then perhaps they would be. Many times in history, they thought that, this war happening, that's Gog and Magog. For example, a lot of the Crusades could have easily fit that. If the redemption had taken place, if the Jewish people were ready and pushed for it, then perhaps it would have happened in their days, but it didn't happen. However, and this is something that always gives me gives me optimistic look at the book of Ezekiel, and that is you start seeing from chapter 36 and on. This is very important that the description of the great events that are to take place in in the messianic future, the times of redemption, seem to actually have taken place already, and that's kind of fortunate for us. For example, Maimonides describes all that's supposed to happen at the end of the days, the symptoms of redemption, the arrival of the Messiah, the ingathering of the exiles, the rebuilding of the temple, a new Jewish commonwealth, the elimination of idolatry throughout the world. Those are all wonderful things. Maimonides says no one really knows the order in which they'll take place. There are, like we said in previous shurim, it's kind of weird that great Jewish scholars insisted that the first thing be the arrival of Messiah. And before that, you can't have an ingathering of the exiles. can't have a Jewish state, can't have the building of the temple. You can't strive for any of these things. The chief rabbi even poskin this way. This is a Satmar position that you can't have this. You have to wait for the Messiah first. And the Maimonides says, yeah, the Messiah is one who gathers the exiles and eventually builds the temple. But he says, the next chapter, no one really knows the order in which all these things will happen. And it turns out we have been witness, thank God, in the past generations to see that first the ingathering of the exiles is supposed to happen. And who knows, maybe we'll succeed in rebuilding the temple before the Messiah shows up. God willing, maybe the Messiah will arrive perhaps tomorrow, just in time for the elections, about which we will have more to say in a minute. But the point is that you don't know how it was going to play out. And Maimonides points out you don't know the order, but we've had the merit to actually see some of these things actually do play out, and now we know some of the order. It's interestingly enough that if you follow Ezekiel now, start in chapter 36, in verse 32, he talks about the ingathering of exiles. And he says that that will be a sanctification of God's name, because the Israelites, the Jewish people persisting in the diaspora, is a desecration of his great name. The ingathering exiles will be God's great sanctification of his own name. So that's the first thing. And then he talks about settling the land. We shavtem ba'aretz asher natati lavotechem. You will sit in the land I gave to your ancestors. V'karati el hadagan v'irbeiti oto l'ten alechem ra'av. I will call to the grain, and I will increase it, and I will not allow you to starve. V'irbeiti et pri haaretz utnuvasat hazeh. And I will call to the fruit of the tree and to the yield of the field. So you see, God first predicts the ingathering exiles, and then agricultural renaissance. God will allow the land to provide for the people who live there. And the next paragraph says that they'll rebuild the destroyed cities, and they will settle those cities, and they'll build new fortifications. Well, my grandfather saw this come true. And then God says, next paragraph, that God will increase the population. What will he do? Arbeotam katson adam. And he says, just like sheep multiply, just fill the land with Jews. So what do we have here? Ingathering exiles, uh, the, the agricultural revolution, the building of the new cities, and then the population increase. And then he talks about the vision of the dry bones, the valley of the dry bones, which is a prophecy of the resurrection, a very important theological point here. We believe in the resurrection of the dead, but we believe in that in two ways. The physical resurrection of the dead, let's say people who have died hundreds of years ago, physically arriving suddenly right now, every single person who's ever lived, rising from the grave physically in this world, is not what we believe in. We believe that the resurrection of the dead is something that is entirely of the next world. That is a different reality altogether that has been prophesied as post-messianic. And it's not the place to get into all the details of that. Physical resurrection of every single dead person is not something that is going to happen in this reality. However, there's also the resurrection, as has been pointed out by the Vilna Gaon, the resurrection of the dead as a metaphor for the reconstitution of the Jewish nation and the Jewish state in the land of Israel. And that is exactly what we have seen today. I think I have previous videos explaining the Vilna Gaon saying this explicitly, that the destruction, well, he wrote this explicitly, the destruction of the temple was basically a decapitation of the Jewish people. And if you decapitate a body, so right there, it looks fresh, it's still basically alive, it was alive a second ago. And then the ravages of time basically cause decomposition, and eventually even the entire skeleton is gone, and it's scattered to the wind. And the reversal of that is gathering up the bones, exactly as described here in Ezekiel, and then reconstituting the body around and the flesh around that until it is a completely whole body, and then it is reanimated, given its soul back, and then it comes back to life. And that is a mashal, for an allegory for the reconstitution of the Jewish nation. So the resurrection alluded to here is the rebirth of the Jewish nation, the founding of the state of Israel. And then the next prophecy is about Jewish reunification. Just like then, Ephraim and Yehuda were completely separated. Ephraim represents the northern tribes, Yehuda represents the southern tribes. They are the two dominant tribes. So too, God will bring them together one day. Jewish unification is the next stage. And that is what the stage basically where we find ourselves now. And then we have this war, Gog and Magog, takes us already to chapter 38, a cataclysmic war, which, by the way, like I said, we hope if it has to happen, Doesn't have to happen because the prophecy of bad, only the good parts have to happen. But we do hope that if it does happen, it'll be in the easiest, the lightest interpretation possible. And who it involves, the sages don't really seem to care who steps into this role. Just like, by the way, Rabbi Soloveitchik and others point out, who steps into the role of a Malik doesn't have to be the physical descendants of a Malik. It could be whoever picks up the mantle. So in this case, we're not going to say that, oh, because these hordes came from the Far East or from North America, they don't fit the prophecy. I'm not saying I want the Chinese or the Americans to wage a great final apocalyptic war against the Jewish people in the land of Israel. I'm just saying that the sages didn't have a particular hakpadah, that it has to be particular people to fit the prophecy. And then the last prophecy he has, starting in chapter 40, is the rebuilding of the temple. So we've seen that these prophecies seem to be in a very natural order, and we've basically seen half of it already. We saw the kibbutz galiot, the rebirth of the agriculture here, the rebuilding of the cities, the population increase, the resurrection, the rebuilding of the state. We're having a little bit of a bump in the road with the Jewish reunification, and hopefully we'll skip the cataclysmic war part and go straight to the rebuilding of the temple. And in the rebuilding of the temple, it's assumed that there's already a Messiah. That's the Nasi. Although, if I were a little bit clear, I would perhaps say, Putin does fit this role of the king of Magog, Meshech, and Tuval, who is not referred to as king ever. He's referred to Nasi Rosh. So I think his official title was president. So not king. Okay, so that's a little bit, but I don't really care. I certainly hope that God bless Putin and keep him far away. Like they say, and Fiddler on the Roof. We don't need people like that. Then again, we have our own Rishaim here in the land of Israel. We also hope that God keep them and bless them and keep them far away from us also, and that we actually have leadership that is fitting for our people.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.